Great to be here with Andrew Bremberg, who is the Assistant to the President for Domestic Policy. Andrew has a very distinguished record prior to that, though, and served in a key and pivotal role during the transition, and also was the Policy Director for the Platform Committee, no easy job, at the RNC convention this summer. Andrew holds a degree from one of America's finest colleges, the Franciscan University at Steubenville, Ohio, and a law degree from Catholic University here in the city where sound travels faster than light. And he is now a recovering lawyer working for the country. Andrew, it's been only 5 weeks from this day since you took office, and already so much has been done. What has been the president's main approach to reversing much of the Obama agenda?
Well, thank you so much, and thank you to CPAC for having me. It's great to be back at CPAC. I've been here many times as a participant. That's a great question because, as I'm sure you all heard from the president this morning, he is focused on rolling back much of the Obama agenda and focused on deregulating and creating growth and jobs for the American people. All right. Right out of the gate, President Trump signed an executive order on Obamacare to direct all government agencies to prepare for the repeal and replace of Obamacare, and to take every action to stop the burdens that terrible law has had on the American people. Since then, he has signed numerous executive orders enforcing our immigration laws, focusing on deregulation, and this entire approach to reorienting the federal government to follow the law and to reduce burdens on the American people is what we've started with, and what he is, I think, clearly laid out, is committed to, and what we'll keep doing in the future.
Andrew, last week, President Trump said that he, quote unquote, inherited a mess. That may have been a rare understatement for President Trump, but I want to know, how bad was the mess?
So this is something that I think everyone understands going into the election. And those of us working in the transition learned even more of, and now that we are working in the government, it becomes clearer by the day what a terrible mess the Obama administration left to the American people. Again, Obamacare is a clear example of that. I'm sure many of you have all followed the problems with Obamacare. More than 25% premium increases last year, health plans pulling out of the market, reduced access to plans, reduced options. That is a huge mess that, unless this administration is able to work with Congress to pass repeal and replace of Obamacare, that problem only gets worse. So that's why we cannot wait. And we are actively working with our partners in the House and the Senate to fulfill the president's commitment to repeal and replace Obamacare for the American people. Economically, the regulatory wet blanket that the Obama administration put on all sorts of sectors across our economy over the last 8 years really dampens much of the opportunity for economic growth. And that's why the president has focused squarely on reducing the regulatory burden on the economy to grow jobs. So for instance, his first week in office, the president signed an executive order referred to as 1 in and 2 out on the regulatory climate, so that for every new regulation that an agency publishes or puts into effect, it has to repeal at least 2 other ones. And the focus of that is to really the focus of that is to really reduce the regulatory cost, so that over time we are getting rid of all of these costs that have been burdening various sectors of the economy. And in fact, today, after the president was here at CPAC, I was with him in the Oval Office when he signed a new executive order just today on enforcing his regulatory agenda. So this is a new executive order just signed today that directs the establishment of a regulatory reform task force in every regulatory agency, a regulatory reform officer who is tasked with implementing these policies and identifying and finding all these legacy and new regulatory burdens that have been put on our economy, to find them, identify them, and really pull them up and get them out so that we can get more economic growth.
And regulation and over-regulation in particular, Andrew, have been one of the things that you've worked on personally the most. Regulation is a tax. On whom is that burden seen most directly, and who bears the brunt of that
That is a great way of looking at it because, and I've always used this analogy, that 100 years ago when Congress spent money and appropriated money, there was never a budget. There was no budget. It just was spent. Now we can't imagine the idea of Congress not trying to pass and have a budget, which is so important. The regulatory burden that the government exerts on the private economy should be viewed the same way. Anytime the government regulates and requires a company or individuals or different groups to conduct certain activities a certain way, that is a direct financial cost, and in a sense should be looked at like a tax, in a way that we tax our private economy. So, we actually don't know the full scope of federal regulation in terms of its actual annual cost in the economy, but estimates are upwards of $2 trillion every year. So this is a key focus, and who bears that? Every American, every business, whether it's in reduced jobs, lower wages, higher cost of goods and services, those regulations seep into our entire economy and reduce productivity. So just hearing that Chairman Brady talk about the need for tax reform, and that's what we are going to deliver to the American people this year, we need to deliver, and that's where the president is very focused on, real regulatory reform that will remove all these impediments and get the economy moving again.
And Andrew, shouldn't it scare the living bejeebies out of everybody here and everybody in the viewing audience that we don't know what that number is? And how do we possibly get our hands around that? I mean, how do we know?
That's right. That's right. We don't know, and that's why the president has taken such strong action on, for every new regulation coming in, there are going to be 2 coming out that are going to offset the costs. So we are going to find out these costs, and just today, he directed that every agency set up these new regulatory reform officers and task force whose job it is to identify all of these regulatory costs that have been built in, both the ones that remain from many of these regulatory systems were put in place decades ago when our economy was very different. And then we have the new regulations that the Obama administration put on top of that. So that is why our mission is to go through all of those regulations and find those that are really hampering economic growth and freedom in our economy.
Only 5 weeks in, and already a lot of folks are talking about, the rest of the Trump agenda and what's yet to come. So what can we expect in the weeks ahead?
Well, I'm sure as you heard from the president, you can expect a lot of action coming from the president and from his administration. We have an incredible cabinet that has already mostly been confirmed. Once we finish getting through the Democratic obstruction in the Senate, we will get the rest of our cabinet put in place with amazing cabinet secretaries that will help really begin to implement the president's vision across all these agencies. But at a much higher level, the president has said clearly and consistently that we are going to repeal and replace Obamacare. That is an issue I work on closely with Secretary Price and leadership in the House and the Senate right now to deliver on that promise to the American people. We are going to work on tax reform and pass fundamental tax reform that will dramatically lessen the tax burden on the American people and our economy to help spur growth and bring jobs back to the United States. We will continue to see the federal government following the law and implementing our immigration laws to enforce these laws to keep the American people safe. And we will see a strong push, not just on the deregulatory side, but also on reducing the permitting time and identifying the proper sources of funding to fully fund a huge investment in infrastructure that our country has sorely needed. So,
can innovation play a larger role as opposed to regulation in strengthening the economy and dealing with the problems that we confront?
That is exactly right. Frankly, it's a big mistake that the Obama administration made. That for all their talk about technology and innovation and data, that they didn't look to the private sector and say, you are innovating in all new ways through using technology, and you have access to whole new kinds of data that didn't even exist before. We need to reshape and relook at how we regulate, right? These regulations have been put in place decades ago when these types of data, certain type of economic arrangements didn't exist. So we need to work with the private sector. I mean, everyone wants government to have rules. We want rules so that we protect the public health and safety of the American people, but we want those rules to make sense, not be overly burdensome, and provide stability, predictability, and clarity to industry so they can grow. I mean, talking with businesses, they want to follow the rules. They just want to know what the rules are, and they're not going to change tomorrow. So I think the use of data and technology is going to be a tremendous tool in helping us reframe how government regulates in a 21st century economy.
Terrific. You are the President's point man on all of this. As the Director of the Domestic Policy Council, what are, so that everybody understands them, the keys and what are the top priorities for dealing with the regulatory burden and for domestic policy generally and broadly?
Absolutely. Well, as I mentioned, one of the President's top priorities is in fulfilling his campaign promise to repeal and replace Obamacare. So we are working aggressively on that right now. Directly.
And that's coming up. That's coming
up. Absolutely. That's coming up. And we need all of your support on that, too. Coming up next on the regulatory side, we're putting in place structural regulatory reforms right now. They're going to help ensure that we don't have new regulatory burdens added and to start bringing down the built-in regulatory costs. What we'll see next is you'll start seeing that happen.
Great.
As agencies actually start to pull back those specific regulations. So I hope all of you watch closely as this administration moves forward, as each of our cabinet secretaries move forward with new policies that will start reducing these regulations, whether they're old legacy ones or new regulations that were just put in by the Obama administration. They have to go.
You said a moment ago that you said a moment ago that you need support from the folks here. What specifically can these activists here in this hall and across the country or tuning in do to be helpful to move this agenda forward?
Absolutely. And I've never been a speaker at CPAC before. I've been a participant in the crowd many times. And as an activist, I know that working with my local community, local political groups, different issue advocacy groups, and contacting whether it's the administration or members of Congress to make sure they know that you are counting on them to fulfill their promises. So I think providing that support, helping provide us more information, more, whether it's anecdotes or data, personal stories or collections of stories of the harm that regulations or Obamacare or different policies have done to help inform policymakers so that we can use that and use that as a communication tool as we explain to the American people why we are changing these policies and how doing so will improve your lives, businesses, and the lives of Americans all across the country.
Andrew Bremberg, thank you so much for all you're doing to make America great again. Ladies and gentlemen, Andrew Bremberg, Assistant to the President for Domestic Policy. Great job. Great job. Let me go out this way. Great job.